Stop. Listen. Pay attention. Chosen one, this moment is not passing you by accidentally. You are here because something in you stayed awake even while you were tired. Because even now as you listen, there is a quiet pressure behind your eyes and a weight in your chest that you have not fully named. This is not a warning. It is a call to notice. You have been carrying more than you let on. Not loudly, not dramatically. You kept moving, kept functioning, kept responding to life as if everything was manageable. But underneath that surface competence, there has been a steady strain. Fatigue that sleep does not quite resolve. A sense of being alone, even when others are present. Moments of confusion, where you wonder why things that should have broken you somehow did not yet still left a residue you cannot explain. This message meets you right there. There has been urgency without panic in your life recently. A tightening of timelines. Subtle pressure to decide to adjust, to hold steady, while variables shifted around you. You may have felt exposed as if supports you once relied on were absent or unreliable. And still, you remained. You showed up. You did not collapse even when it would have been understandable to do so. Notice that. This is not about convincing you of anything. It is about clarity, about placing language around an experience you have already lived through. You are not being told what will happen. You are being helped to understand what already did. You might have questioned yourself quietly, asked whether you were missing something obvious, whether your calm was denial or your steadiness was numbness. You might have felt pressure without a visible source, like standing in a strong wind that leaves no fingerprints. That tension is real and it has a structure. But you do not need to brace yourself right now. Stay with the steadiness you already have. This message is intentional, and it is personal because it speaks to a moment where you stood without the protections you expected and remained intact. You did not need to announce it. You did not need to dramatize it. Your nervous system held. Your sense of self did not fragment. You stayed oriented. You are not here to be alarmed. You are here to understand. Clarity is coming step by step in a way that respects your intelligence and your lived reality. Nothing is being taken from you in this process. Something is being named, and naming it matters. Breathe once. Stay present. You do not need to move ahead. This transmission continues from exactly where you are standing now. This message is for you specifically, and it is important to remove any uncertainty about that. You are not listening out of curiosity. You are listening because something in your system recognized itself in the opening moments. There was no dramatic reaction, no emotional spike, just a quiet sense of alignment. That is how you know. This is not a broad statement meant to capture everyone. It is precise. It matches your experience too closely to be accidental. You are the one who remained steady when conditions suggested you should not have. You are the one who noticed that your reactions did not match the intensity of what you were facing. Situations that usually trigger panic, collapse, or impulsive decisions in others did not dismantle you. You may not have felt strong. You may not have felt confident. But you stayed coherent. That distinction matters. What happened involved you directly. Not symbolically, not theoretically. In real time, your internal systems held alignment under strain. You did not need to summon courage or motivate yourself into resilience. There was no inner speech convincing you to survive. Your stability was automatic. It was already there before the pressure arrived. This is an identity marker, not an achievement. Many people believe strength is something you activate in moments of crisis. You have seen that model fail repeatedly. What you demonstrated was different. Your resistance was not loud. It did not announce itself. It did not require effort. It functioned quietly beneath conscious thought, like a structure that has already been reinforced. You may have underestimated this, because it did not feel heroic. It felt normal to you. But normal is relative to what you are built to carry. There is a difference between conscious struggle and unconscious stability. Conscious struggle looks like effort tension and visible coping. Unconscious stability looks like continuity, like waking up and continuing your life even when circumstances suggest interruption. Like maintaining your values, your rhythm, your sense of self without having to defend them internally. You did not bypass difficulty. You absorbed it without distortion. This is why this message is for you, not because you are better than others, but because your system responded differently. You did not fragment. You did not lose orientation. You did not need external validation to stay grounded. Even in moments where you questioned yourself, the questioning did not dislodge you from your center. That kind of stability does not develop overnight. It is not luck. It is not personality. It is the result of an internal structure that has been forming for a long time, often unnoticed by you. As you continue listening, do not look for instructions yet. Simply recognize yourself in what is being described. Recognition is the first lock. Once it clicks, the rest unfolds naturally. There is one symptom you recognize immediately, even if you have never spoken it out loud. It is not fear in the obvious sense. It is not panic or despair. It is a persistent low-level tension that sits beneath your daily life like a background frequency you cannot turn off. A pressure that does not announce itself loudly, but makes everything feel slightly heavier. You have wondered if this meant something was wrong with you. If you were failing to relax, failing to be present, failing to enjoy what you already have. That interpretation has been inaccurate. What you experienced was not a flaw. It was a signal. You judged yourself for feeling strained when there was no visible emergency. You questioned why your body felt alert when your mind told you everything was technically fine. You may have tried to correct it by resting more, distracting yourself, or pushing through with discipline. None of those fully resolved it because the sensation was not asking to be eliminated. It was asking to be understood. This kind of tension appears when a system is carrying load just below conscious awareness. Not overload. Load. The difference matters. Overload causes breakdown. Load causes pressure without collapse. You stayed functional. You stayed relational. You stayed capable. That tells you everything you need to know. Your body and mind were responding to transition, not danger. During periods of internal reorganization, the nervous system often holds a heightened baseline. Muscles stay subtly engaged. Attention remains slightly sharpened. Sleep may become lighter. Emotions may feel flatter or more contained, not because they are suppressed, but because resources are being allocated elsewhere. This can feel confusing when there is no obvious reason for it. So you assumed something was wrong. Nothing was wrong. You were stabilizing through change. You might have noticed moments where you felt oddly detached, as if observing yourself from a small distance. Not dissociation, but perspective. A widening of awareness that made emotional reactions slower and more deliberate. That is not avoidance. That is regulation under pressure. You also may have felt a quiet sadness without a clear story attached to it, or a seriousness that did not match your external circumstances. These are common signals when an internal threshold is being crossed. Old reference points lose relevance. New ones have not fully integrated yet. The space between them feels uncomfortable, but it is temporary. This is why self-judgment did not help. You were not failing to cope. You were adapting. When systems evolve, they generate heat. That heat feels like pressure, restlessness, or fatigue. But it also carries information. It tells you something is reorganizing in a way that requires steadiness, not urgency. You did the most important thing without realizing it. You did not panic about the sensation. You kept living. You kept choosing consistency over interpretation. That allowed the signal to do its work without becoming a problem. Now that it is being named, it no longer needs to remain ambiguous. And with that clarity, you are ready to understand what that pressure was responding to and why it arrived when it did. What you were responding to was not imaginary, and it was not internal noise. There was an increase in pressure that did not originate from within you, yet it interacted directly with your internal systems. Not in a dramatic or cinematic way, in a grounded, observable way. It arrived as a convergence of demands, expectations, and subtle destabilizations that appeared ordinary on the surface, but were coordinated in timing and effect. This kind of pressure does not announce itself with crisis. It accumulates. It shows up as overlapping responsibilities, unresolved conversations, shifting dynamics, and moments where the ground feels less predictable than it did before. None of these elements are extreme on their own. Together, they create a field that tests stability rather than strength. This happened recently, not all at once, but within a compressed window of time. You may have noticed that several unrelated areas of your life required adjustment simultaneously. Energy was drawn in multiple directions, attention was fragmented, support felt thinner, and still you remained operational. You did not lose your sense of sequence or proportion. That matters. What is important to understand is that this was not random. Systems tend to apply pressure where there is capacity. Stress does not target the weakest point. It reveals the strongest one. The fact that you stayed functional under layered demand indicates that your internal structure could absorb it without disintegration. You did not need to fight anything. You did not need to confront an enemy or overcome a threat. You simply stayed present while the pressure moved through. That is a form of confrontation that does not require force. You might have expected yourself to react more strongly, to feel angry or more afraid or more overwhelmed. Instead, your responses were measured, sometimes muted, sometimes delayed. That is not avoidance. That is your system prioritizing continuity over expression. Even when fatigue set in, it did not derail you. Even when motivation dipped, you did not abandon your responsibilities or your values. You adjusted pace instead of direction. You reduced output without losing coherence. This is what regulation looks like when it is deeply embedded. The unseen aspect of this experience is not mystical. It is structural. Pressure tested the integrity of your routines, your emotional boundaries, and your sense of self. You did not fracture at those points. You flexed. That flexibility is not accidental. It is the result of long-term adaptation, often built through earlier experiences that required you to mature without support or recognition. Those experiences created internal scaffolding you may not consciously acknowledge, but it is there. This section of your life asked a quiet question. Would you remain intact when nothing obvious was protecting you? You already answered it, not with words, but with steadiness. To understand what you move through, it helps to slow it down and separate the pressure into its distinct points, not to dramatize them, but to make them visible. When pressure remains undefined, it feels heavier than it is. When it is named, its impact becomes measurable. The first point was doubt, but not the obvious kind. It was not loud self-criticism or spiraling thoughts. It was subtle, a quiet questioning of whether your steadiness meant disengagement, whether your lack of reaction meant something was missing. You noticed that others would have reacted more emotionally, more urgently, and you briefly wondered if your calm was a flaw. What matters is that this doubt did not take root. It passed through without altering your behavior or your self-trust. You did not need to resolve it. You simply did not follow it. The second point was fear, though it arrived without imagery or panic. It showed up as anticipation. as the sense that something could go wrong even if nothing had yet. This kind of fear often leads people to overcorrect, to control, to rush decisions. You did none of that. You acknowledged the possibility without letting it dictate your actions. Fear stayed informational rather than directive. That requires internal regulation most people do not have access to under pressure. The third point was energy drain. You felt it in your body more than your thoughts. A slower start to the day, a heavier feeling in your limbs, a need for more recovery time. This is often where people push too hard or collapse entirely. You did neither. You adjusted output without self-reproach. You allowed fatigue to exist without turning it into a narrative about weakness. That allowed your energy to stabilize rather than deplete further. The fourth point was isolation. Not physical separation, but the sense that what you were carrying could not be fully shared. You may have been surrounded by people and still felt alone in the experience. This is where many lose orientation. They look outward for reassurance or inward for justification. You stayed neutral. You did not demand understanding. You did not withdraw completely either. You maintained connection without requiring it to solve anything. That balance is rare. The fifth point was delay. Things did not resolve as quickly as logic suggested they should. Timelines stretched. Responses came later than expected. Outcomes remained temporarily unclear. This kind of delay often creates agitation or despair. You noticed the tension, but you did not amplify it. You did not interpret delay as failure. You allowed uncertainty to remain open without filling it with assumptions. That preserved your internal coherence. Across all 5 points, there is a pattern worth noticing. You did not override your experience, and you did not become consumed by it. You stayed in relationship with what was happening without needing to control it. That is not passive. It is regulated engagement. At no point did you disconnect from your values. At no point did you abandon your sense of proportion. Even when your emotions felt muted or distant, your decisions remained aligned. Even when your energy dipped, your identity stayed intact. This is not accidental. It reflects an internal system that prioritizes stability over expression when conditions require it. Most people believe resilience looks like effort. What you demonstrated looked like containment. You absorbed pressure without leaking it into your relationships, your choices, or your self-concept. That does not mean you felt nothing. It means what you felt did not dictate who you became in those moments. This breakdown is not meant to elevate you. It is meant to be accurate. What you moved through was complex, layered, and sustained. And you remained steady through each point without needing to name it at the time. Now that it is named, you can see it clearly. And clarity changes how the experience lives in you going forward. Now, it is appropriate to look back at what occurred with a different lens. Not to relive it, not to analyze it endlessly, but to review it with enough distance to recognize its shape. When you do, this one conclusion becomes unavoidable. What you experienced cannot be explained by chance, by personality traits, or by temporary mood. It has a coherence that points inward, not outward. You did not get lucky. Luck produces inconsistency. It works once and disappears under sustained demand. What you demonstrated was consistent across multiple points of pressure over time. Your responses followed a pattern: calm without detachment, awareness without reactivity, adjustment without collapse. That pattern indicates internal organization. There is a tendency to minimize this by saying you were just doing what needed to be done. That statement is true, but incomplete. Many people know what needs to be done and still cannot do it under pressure. Knowing is not the same as maintaining coherence while doing. What stands out in review is not what you felt, but what did not happen. You did not catastrophize. You did not lose perspective. You did not abandon your routines or your ethics. You did not need someone else to stabilize you. Even when support was present, you did not lean on it to regulate yourself. You remained self-referential in the healthiest sense. You also did not harden. Under pressure, some people become rigid. They narrow emotionally, defensively to survive. You stayed flexible. You allowed moments of uncertainty without closing. You allowed fatigue without resentment. You allowed ambiguity without rushing to resolve it. That flexibility is a sign of integration, not toughness. It is important to remove coincidence from the explanation. Coincidence does not produce regulation. Coincidence does not explain why your nervous system stayed within a functional range while multiple stressors overlapped. Coincidence does not account for your ability to pace yourself intuitively without external instruction. What you accessed was internal coherence. This coherence is not something you turned on. It was already present. It emerged because conditions required it to. Pressure reveals structure. It does not create it. If the structure were not there, the outcome would have been different. You might still be tempted to downplay this because it did not feel dramatic. There was no moment of triumph, no clear ending, no external confirmation. That is precisely why it matters. The most reliable capacities do not announce themselves. They function. As you reflect, you may notice a quiet confidence beginning to replace confusion. Not arrogance, not certainty about the future. Just an understanding that something in you is reliable. That you can be inside difficulty without losing yourself. That realization does not require you to change anything immediately. It simply recontextualizes what you already lived through. You are no longer guessing whether you can hold under pressure. You have evidence, and evidence settles the nervous system in a way reassurance never can. This understanding sets the stage for the next layer of clarity, where comparison becomes unavoidable, not to inflate you, but to accurately place what you experienced within a broader human context. When you place your experience alongside common human reactions, the contrast becomes clear without needing exaggeration. Most people respond to far less pressure with visible disruption. Their sleep breaks down quickly. Their emotional range narrows or spikes. Decision-making becomes reactive. They search for relief, validation, or escape. This is not a flaw. It is the natural outcome of systems that are not built to hold sustained ambiguity and demand at the same time. What distinguishes your experience is not that you avoided strain. It is that strain did not disorganize you. Under similar conditions, many people would have withdrawn completely or overextended themselves trying to regain control. Some would have externalized the pressure through conflict. Others would have internalized it through self-blame. You did neither. You stayed present. You continued to function. You adjusted where necessary without abandoning your center. This does not make you superior. It makes your response uncommon. Uncommon responses often feel invisible to the person having them because they do not break routine. You still went about your days. You still handled responsibilities. You still interacted with others. There was no dramatic deviation to signal that something exceptional was happening. And yet, internally, you were operating under conditions that cause many to fragment. You did not. It is important to be precise here. Your stability was not numbness. You were aware of the pressure. You felt fatigue. You noticed tension. You were not detached from your experience. You simply did not let it hijack your behavior or your identity. That distinction separates regulation from suppression. Many people collapse under less because their sense of self is tightly bound to comfort, certainty, or immediate feedback. When those are disrupted, their internal reference points disappear. You did not rely on those references. Your orientation came from something more stable. Again, this is not about comparison for ego. It is about accurate placement. When something functions outside the norm, it deserves to be recognized as such, not dismissed as ordinary. Dismissing it creates confusion later, because you underestimate what you are capable of sustaining. You stayed functional without becoming rigid. You stayed aware without becoming overwhelmed. You stayed connected without becoming dependent. These are not common combinations under pressure. Recognizing this does not mean you expect more pressure. It means you stop questioning your capacity when pressure arises. You no longer need to wonder whether your calm is avoidance or your steadiness is denial. You have context now. What you demonstrated sits outside typical stress responses, not because you tried to be different, but because your internal structure is organized differently. That difference does not demand attention. It simply exists. And understanding that prepares you to clarify who you are beneath the circumstances that briefly tested you. What becomes clear now is that what held you steady was not something you activated in the moment. It was already there. Your strength did not switch on under pressure. It did not surge or spike. It remained consistent. That tells you something essential about its nature. This is not a reactive strength. It is baseline. It is the default state your system returns to when things become uncertain. Many people mistake this for emotional flatness or underreaction. You may have wondered if you were disengaged or detached because you did not feel dramatic shifts. In reality, your internal structure is simply organized around coherence rather than intensity. When pressure arrives, your system does not escalate. It consolidates. This points to preparation, not performance. Preparation does not mean training for a specific event. It means the slow, often invisible development of internal order. Over time, through experiences that required you to grow up early, self-regulate without guidance, or make sense of complexity without clear answers, your system learned how to stay integrated.